Does everybody know the difference between the different airbrushes? All right, basically, what most people are familiar with is the bottom feed. Generally, most of them come with a bottle. Probably seeing the bottle just goes in the bottom. Put your paint in there, and it siphons up through the tube and comes out the end. They also have little color cups if you're just using a few drops of paint. That's probably, most people start with that brush. Then there's the next one's a gravity feed. That has the paint reservoirs right on top. Paint feeds directly into the body of the brush. They're geared more towards detail because they don't have to siphon the paint up. Paint's right there. I mean, if you pull back like that with a needle with no air pressure, the paint will eventually drip out. And I guess that's why they call it gravity feed. So. Then there's the side feed, which is similar to the gravity feed. The paint actually comes in through the side of the airbrush. If it's got a bowl like this, it works similar to the gravity feed because the paint's flowing down. But it also comes with a bottle that you can hook in the side. The bottle would actually go in like that with a siphon tube. That's for this broader coverage, I guess. But basically, those are the three different styles of airbrushes, and those are all double action. I've got an old single action here. Some of you probably have used those, where almost all single actions are bottom feed as well. You put the bottle on, and all you do is press the button, and the paint comes out. It has a adjustment for the needle in the back, so you just back it off if you want more paint flow, but it always gives you the same amount of paint. Well, it depends on where the needle's set, but that's a basic difference between these. These particular ones, these are the Badger's new Renegade series airbrushes. The bottom feed comes with a .33 millimeter needle, which is 0.33. That's little over 3/10 of a millimeter is that hole that the paint actually comes through. That's pretty fine. But the side feed and the gravity feed come with a 0.21 millimeter tip. So that's even smaller yet. That's geared towards the ultrafine detail work. The finer needle setups, they're capable of doing fairly broad coverage. I mean, if you pull back and have the needle all the way back, the trigger all the way back, you can get a pretty broad spray. But they're geared, with the fine tip like that, it's geared more towards detailing, but they'll still work for a little bit of broad coverage, but it's always good to have 2 or 3 airbrushes. This one I have set up with an ultrafine tip, and to change it back to the fine setup it came with, it's a 3-part deal. There's a little tiny cone in there, the tip, and then there's a needle, and the very last piece that screws on is called regulator. That's a little bit different size. Yeah, pretty much all the internal parts for these 3 brushes are interchangeable. Actually, they are interchangeable. But you have to you got to make sure you have the fine tip, the fine needle, and the fine regulator. Because if you mix and match them, you could really have trouble. Because if you put in the big needle and the fine and the ultra-fine regulator, there's not going to be enough airflow around it to get any paint to flow out. Because there's got to be airflow around that needle in order to get the paint to draw through. Well, it's personal preference. It's more the way I hold my airbrush. A lot of people use the tip of their finger to get the paint flow and moving. I like to have my finger on the body. The airbrush gives me better control, and I actually I just use the center part of my finger to actually work the trigger. So the top feed, the bowl kind of gets in my way, so I've just gotten used to this. And a lot of guys like the side feed because you can look down, you can actually sight down the body of the gun and watch what you're painting. But I watch a lot of guys use the side feed or the top feed, and they just paint at an angle like this, and they've got a good view of it that way too. So it's more or less personal preference, because even the bottom feeds with the ultra-fine setups capable of doing really, really fine detail. It's just more or less what you're used to.
Which one would you recommend? Where would you start out with?
I would say probably the bottom feed, just because it's got the little bigger needle setup, so it's not quite as finicky as far as paint viscosity and stuff, and it's just fairly easy to use.
What do you use for a cleaner on your airbrushes?
When I'm running water-based paint, which I do 90% of the time, basically what I have a bottle of ammonia solution. It's just regular ammonia from the grocery store mixed with water, usually anywhere from 20 to 30% mix, 20% ammonia. If it's 20%, it's 20% ammonia, 80% water. It's just a little bit strong. A lot of guys use Windex, but this is a little bit cheaper. And then if certain paints are a little bit tougher to get off, so this way you can kind of custom mix it, make it a little stronger if you need it. But that works good. And then a lot of times I'll flush it. To clean it, I'll use just regular rubbing alcohol. I like to get the 70%. That cuts through the water-based paint really good.
When you change colors, should you disassemble and clean it, or just rinse it?
No, what I do generally is just rinse it. I have a sink right where I paint. Within 8 feet is the sink, and I'll just run it under running water and flush it out real good. Then I back flush it. Basically, when I back flush, what I do is I'll have the water or the ammonia solution in here, and I'll be running it through the brush like that. And then I take a brush. This is a fabric dye brush I get from Michael's. It's a stiff bristle brush, not real stiff, but not soft like an artist brush. And what I do is I cover the needle and the end right up with that, and that makes the air blow back through the whole body, down through the paint channel and back into here, and it kind of back flushes. I'll do that a couple times and run it through the water, and once I back flush, I'll dump it out, fill it up, run some through, back flush. Once I get clean fluid in here, then I know the color's gone, and I'll change colors. Really disassembling an airbrush, totally disassembling, you should only do that, you can kind of tell when your brush is starting to get dirty just by feel, but generally all you need to do is take the needle out at the end of the day when you're done painting, make sure that's good and clean, put a little lubricant on it and put it back in. And a brush should last like that for a couple weeks anyway without having to take it apart, as long as you're back flushing it good. It's just the more you take a brush completely apart, the more, you'll see in a sec, there's a lot of little parts, the more you can get into trouble just, losing a part or not putting it back together right. And it's not really necessary to disassemble them totally like that.
You mentioned, lubricant. What do you use for lubricant?
Badger and Iwata both have, I'm assuming it's a water-soluble oil, because you're putting it right in the channel where the paint goes through, and I've never had issues. Badger's is called needle juice. I'm not sure, I don't remember what Iwata calls theirs, but when you use lacquers, you have to clean it totally different, of course. Don't ever use lacquer to try to flush water-based paint out. That can be ugly. Some water-based paint will turn to glue when you put lacquer thinner with it. And you need pliers to get the needle out of the brush. A lot of paints aren't that great. You have to doctor them up so much to get them to spray that they're too thick. That's one reason they dry on the end of the tip. But if you get the right viscosity and then just add maybe 1 or 2 drops of retarder, like per 10 drops of paint, that's if it's dry. I mean, if you have good paint, you shouldn't really have to use retarder unless like you're under the lights like this and it's really dry. or like in the winter when the humidity's way down, it's, then the retarder helps. But and that needle lube that's passing around, that kind of coats the needle a little bit too and helps it from getting built up. You always want to make sure your needle's straight too, because if you have a little hook in the end of it, that'll throw your stream off a little bit, but it also makes the paint build up a lot quicker. So it's always a good idea to make sure, you're always very, very careful with the needle. Make sure it's always straight. If you do bend it, get a nice flat piece of glass or something, and you can usually you can roll it, with a little pressure on it and straighten it out pretty good.
What paint brand would you think would flow the best?
Actually, none of them.
Okay.
Not without doctoring them up. I mean, I used a lot of Wildlife Colors. They have really good paint, real good pigment, but the consistency from batch to batch, as far as viscosity or thickness of the paint, was terrible. I mean, I even I printed up a little thing on the internet and posted it on Taxidermy Net just for, I called it airbrushing for dummies, because it was, guys were just having so much problem with paint, and it was a mix that I found with Wildlife Colors would work the best. I mean, that meant like 3 drops of paint, 10 drops of thinner, 2 micro drops of retarder, and hopefully it was good. That's what the new Badger paint's going to do away with all that, because it's actually going to be truly airbrush ready paint. It really does good, but really, no matter what paint you use, you got to get it to the viscosity of about 2% milk, which is fairly thin, and then when you're doing in close work, to get it to spray consistently, you really have to get your air pressure right. Don't ever get hung up on, I have to be using 35 pounds of pressure, because pressure's got to vary depending on what you're doing. Because you had said you had some trouble getting spots just right. Mm-hmm. That's where if you get your pressure down and you're not blowing so much air, and as long as you got your consistency or paint right, you can get pretty clean spots that way. Where the more air pressure you're using, basically it's going to be a softer looking spot because you got more air mixed in. The paint's spread out a little bit more. You don't get as fine a stream basically. But my take on it is basically all the other life tones, life tone Hydro Mist, Polytranspar, Wildlife Colors, Translatex by Van Dykes, all those paints, none of those are made by an airbrush company. They're all made by, I assume, industrial coating companies. They're making it to certain specifications, but they don't know the internal workings of an airbrush. They don't realize that this paint's got to go through a tip that might be, 0.2 of a millimeter, or even like the custom Micron by Iwata, their actual needle and tip combo is actually 0.18 millimeters, so it's actually smaller than the one on this. And that Badger, owning the paint company, they have their tolerances. Their main concern is making paint that flows through an airbrush with those specifications. Where these other companies, they're just like Createx. That's a nice paint. They've got a lot of good colors, but their paint, one of their main concerns is, because they sell a lot at these hobby stores, is how it looks on the shelf. Their paint, if you ever notice, their pearls and iridescence, you don't have to shake them up too much. The particles, the metallics, the mica's always suspended in the paint solution. Badgers you have to shake, but it goes through an airbrush, where the other stuff, they doctor it up so the pigment's suspended and it looks pretty, but it doesn't go through the airbrush near as nice.
Does the drying time vary from brand to brand?
I think so. I've been showing the Badger paint at the last 3 or 4 taxidermy shows that I went to, and there's a lot of guys that are pretty hardcore lacquer guys, and they say they won't use the water-based paint because it doesn't dry fast, and I was spraying it. I was having them spray it, and they'd start here and work their way over, and I'd interrupt them and say, well, feel that, it's already dry. And they were amazed that it would dry as fast as lacquer. But then again, lacquer paint, if you put it on heavy, it's gonna take a while to dry. It'll get tacky. I mean, you've probably all done it. If you put lacquer on too heavy, you go like this, all of a sudden you got a big chunk stuck to your hand. I mean, the water base is the same way, but as long as you layer it on light, it dries extremely fast. I always have a hair dryer, you know, just if I put a lot of white on a fish belly or something, if I go overboard, I grab the hair dryer and just hit it and try to get it, you know, get it to dry a little quicker. Well, I always have a fan when I paint, even with water-based paints, I have a exhaust fan because water-based paints aren't as toxic as well, actually they're non-toxic, but still the pigments and stuff aren't good to breathe in, especially the metallics and stuff. I mean, if you've ever painted a lot with metallics, all of a sudden you see all these little sparkles in the air, you know, you don't want to breathe those into your lungs, so it's good to have the exhaust fan going.
That can be a potential cause of spattering.
I mean, when you're spraying and all of a sudden you just get a,
Yeah.
well, what this gentleman asked about paint building up on the tip, that's what causes that, because as you're painting, the paint will build up on the tip a little bit, and then sometimes little tiny micro dropouts will build up on there and come off as individual droplets and hit. That's why you'll notice sometimes little spots here and there, or it'll just start spitting, and then you go like this, and all of a sudden that whole gob will come off in one thing, and just, you know, you just get a big gob, or you'll start pulling back the needle, because if you're trying to do detail and all of a sudden it's not coming out, as you draw back the needle, all of a sudden, boom, it'll start flowing, and you got way too much paint. Retarder is the best thing. Retarder is just, all that is, it retards the setting of the paint, so it doesn't cure as fast. Because what it's doing, it's curing so fast. A lot of times that'll happen if you're running too much air pressure, because it's just the more pressure, the more apt it is to dry on the needle. So, I mean, ideally, I always have my compressor set usually around 32, 33 pounds. But Badger has a new little pressure adjustment that goes right on the brush. It's a handy little, it's also a quick disconnect. That way you can turn the pressure right down. On the gravity feed, you can turn it right down to 4 or 5 pounds and still paint with it. And a combination of pressure and retarder and the right paint, and you can virtually do away with those kind of problems. I mean, eventually you're still going to have the problem sooner or later, because it'll be really dry, or maybe the paint's been sitting around and has evaporated some of the stuff out of it, so it's a little thicker than it should be. But as long as you start with the paint at the right viscosity, I mean, pass this around. That's some of the new yellow, and that's the viscosity or the thickness that airbrush paint should be, regardless if you're running it through a .2 tip, or if you have a pache like a VL, the smallest tip in that's a .5, so it's a 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter. You know, so that's pretty big tip. If you have your paint at that thickness, that should cure a lot of the problem. Retarder's it's a solvent. I mean, it's I don't know, polybutyl something or other. I'm not a chemist, but I mean, I can always tell when I put a few drops in if I don't have if I'm doing real fine detail, not spraying a lot. Sometimes I won't have my exhaust fan on, and when I add retarder to it, I can smell it. And I can feel it in my throat, a little bit of irritation. So it's just a chemical that retards the setting of the paint. Whatever paint brand you use, if you use Wildlife Colors, you should use Wildlife Colors retarder. If you use Life Tone, you should use Life Tone retarder. You shouldn't mix and match those components, like the thinners and stuff. Most of the thinners in the water base are like, I think they're just like clear Windex anyway, just really watered down water and ammonia solution. But you really should stick to whatever brand you're using.
Can you get components of that, or?
I can set a brush up however you want it. If you buy a Badger Renegade, okay, let's say you buy the Spirit, the side feed. Basically what you get, the side feed will come with a side feed bottle. It'll come with a side feed cup. Comes with an adapter for a Pache, or for a Iwata air hose, and standard with a .21 needle tip combo. And that's basically what that would be what the Spirit kit is. They don't sell, they do sell a big kit that has all 3 airbrushes. But that's,
But you can't buy the needle and the seat and the,
oh,
the funnel, or the cone that you said.
oh, you can buy it as, it's not sold as a kit, it's just sold as like I think the tip is $5, the regulator is $7, and the needle is $7,
You
so
buy
for,
it as replacement parts then.
yeah, just the replacement parts, and, you know, you can buy the 3 pieces for as much, you know, as you can, 1 needle for an Iwata. Yeah, they sell a compressor, have you heard how noisy this one is? It's been running, you've probably heard it kick off and on a couple times. They have a whole line of different compressors. That's like the deluxe quiet model, it's a silent one. They have little smaller ones that make a little bit of racket. This one actually has a tank, so it's not running constantly, or just, you know, some of them, as you use the air, it'll just stay running. As soon as you stop, it'll stop. But for years, all I've ever used is just one from the Tractor Supply, just a little dual tank with a water trap on it. As long as it has a good pressure regulator. You don't want one that jumps, you know, sometimes they'll jump a little bit, I've seen different regulators on compressors, they'll fluctuate 10 or 15 pounds of pressure as you're using them. You don't want that, you want consistent air.
If your paint kind of comes out like sand, when you first start, and just continues like that, what is it, the paint is too thick or what?
Yeah, it's way too thick,
Way too thick.
yeah.
Retarder or just,
Thinner first, then retarder. Did you see that bottle of yellow paint that was going around?
not just-
When it gets to you, you'll see that's what it should, what we're gonna have is, it's the extender base. It's actually the base formula, what this paint is actually made out of. So it's just, this will actually lower the viscosity a little bit and actually make the paint a little bit more transparent too, which is what thinner does, so. But this way, it just doesn't change the formulation of it, so it's not gonna react different, like if you go over it with some clear coat or something later. You know, if you had something else mixed in with it, all of a sudden you got one paint that's all of a sudden bubbling or something. This keeps it all the same.
Well, that's classified as a water-based paint, correct?
Yes.
What happens if you use water to thin it?
You can use water to thin it.
It won't affect the.
It's not supposed to affect it, but like I say, I like to keep it, you know, with what the chemist told me, you know, you just keep the same components in it, where he said you can do it with water, but generally, as a rule, this paint, I mean, I've got, here's some orange too. I mean, I've been using this stuff for a year now, and it's very consistent. I haven't seen any inconsistencies from color to color, the colors that I've had. I mean, they've always come out, I mean, it's always looks about like this. I mean, just like almost like a milk.
What kind of shelf life do they have?
As long as you keep the cap on it, it should be real good. I mean, I've got a nitrogen tank at home, so I always purge my paints and my polyurethanes and the different things I use with nitrogen. That gives you kind of an indefinite shelf life.
Okay, for those of us who don't have that, any rough idea?
As long as you keep it sealed good, I don't know. I've got some of Chuck's Wildlife Colors. He's the guy who makes those paints that I got back in '97 that I still use occasionally. I mean, they just
I have regular acrylics that I got back in the 80s and I still can use them.
yeah, as long as you have the cap on tight. But if you use a lot of paint, it's not bad to have nitrogen. It's good for. Yeah. Well, like you go to a wine store, I think they sell little cans of it too, because that's what they'll use, you know, before they cork a good bottle of wine up too. It just keeps it from spoiling. Keeps.
What you do, just blow a little bit in there and tighten up the cap?
Yeah, just a little. What it does, it blankets the top. You know, I wouldn't have to fill this all with nitrogen. Nitrogen's heavier than air, so you just put it in. It'll put a little blanket of nitrogen there, and that completely seals it. I got it more not for paint, I do a lot of molding and casting, so I use some polyurethanes and urethanes, and they're very moisture sensitive. They have like a 6-month shelf life, but with nitrogen, I have some stuff that's 6 years old that's still as good as the day they sent it to me.
Have you airbrushed any kind of bone carving in the way that it sticks to it? Because it always seems to end up flaking.
The bone, is it all degreased? It's just all
Yeah,
perfectly clean?
Very clean, yeah.
The bone itself is probably flaking.
Have you
Okay.
tried sealing the bone first? Do a seal around the bone first, like a workable fixative?
Just like a lacquer or something, like a clear lacquer. I've seen some skulls that guys have painted on, 5 years later, and they're still painted. Because bones are pretty porous. I mean, it should have good enough tooth to grip it real well. But I just know some different bones retain grease or oils in them, and that might keep it from binding real good.
You would on wood to get it to stick?
I don't know, I'm usually painting fish. I did a couple steelhead. But, really, I'm not sure. I know when the paint gets in my cup, if I let it dry, it's hard to get off. So it adheres to this is brass, but it's coated. I'm not sure exactly how this particular paint is geared towards sticking to metals.
You really should use a primer if you're gonna be doing metal. Some type of a primer.
Oh, can you hook that badger onto Pache hoses?
No, they will not hook onto a Pache hose. They'll hook onto an Iwata hose because they do come with an adapter, but Badger, they name these the Renegade because they figure guys that would use them are kind of renegades, because Iwata's kind of got, they're the airbrush for detailing, but that these will detail as well as any Iwata that I've ever painted with. And that's their reasoning behind having the Iwata adapter included, so they will fit onto your Iwata hose.